I'm Charlie Savenor, Rabbi Savenor, and I'm really happy to see everybody here as we discuss an excellent book about an extraordinary Jewish life. This is our second meeting that we're having about one of the books in the series, and it gives me great pleasure to invite up Nan Rubin, our co-chair of Adult Education, to introduce our speaker and introduce this evening's program.
I'd like to welcome everyone tonight. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Nan Rubin, and I'm the co-chair of Adult Learning here at Park Avenue Synagogue. We're pleased to welcome guests here in the audience at Park Avenue Synagogue and also at our partner synagogues across the country who are tuning in via live stream. Please welcome Anshe Emet in Chicago, Illinois, B'nai Tikva Shalom in Bloomfield, Connecticut, Bethel Synagogue in St. Louis Park, Minnesota, Congregation Am Hayam in Ventura, California, Beth Jacob Synagogue in Norwich, Connecticut, Road of Shalom Temple in Newport News, Virginia. We also welcome friends from around the world who are now tuning in via live stream. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to everyone here. This is an exceptional series of books about the entire spectrum of the Jewish experience, from antiquity to present, and it's called Jewish Lives. This prize-winning series of biography is a partnership of Yale University Press and the Leon D. Black Foundation. Subjects are very thoughtfully paired with authors to create lively, deeply informed books. So far, 35 books have been published, including titles on Moses, Ben-Gurion, Rav Kook, Barbara Streisand, very wide range, and more. We are reading these books together as a community here at Park Avenue Synagogue in a synagogue engagement program called Reading Jewish Lives, which was launched last fall. Our first live stream, as Rabbi Savenor mentioned, was in November and featured author Stephen Gimbel on the book he wrote on Albert Einstein, and was attended by well over 200 guests. And tonight, we're delighted to hear from eminent film critic and author Molly Haskell on the defining work of the prodigiously talented producer and director Steven Spielberg. More on Miss Haskell and Spielberg in a minute. Let's review how this evening will work. First, we're going to hear from Molly Haskell for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open up the conversation for Q&A. For our friends viewing this live stream, we encourage you to tweet questions to submit for the Q&A portion using the hashtag #JewishLives. Our audience here at Park Avenue may submit questions on note cards, which will be collected by one of our volunteers. And if you need a note card, just raise your hand and we'll provide one for you, especially for those of you who just came in. Our audience here at Park Avenue Synagogue may submit these questions on the note cards. I just mentioned that. So now I'd like to introduce Molly Haskell. The New Republic has called it uncommonly absorbing. The New Yorker has called it a swift and elegant introduction to Spielberg's life and work. These are just a couple of the reviews our guest speaker has received for her book on the life of Steven Spielberg. Molly Haskell grew up in Richmond, Virginia, went to Sweetbriar College, the University of London, and the Sorbonne before settling in New York. She wrote for The Village Voice, first as a theater critic, then as a movie reviewer, and from there wrote for New York Magazine and Vogue. She's written for many publications, including the New York Times, The Guardian, Esquire, and the New York Review of Books. She's been on the selection committee of the New York Film Festival and served as Associate Professor of Film at Barnard and as an Adjunct Professor of Film at Columbia University. She received a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2010 and was featured in the Library of America volume, American Movie Critics. Her previous books include From Reverence to Rape, The Treatment of Women in the Movies, Love and Other Infectious Diseases, and Frankly, My Dear, Gone with the Wind Revisited. It's now my pleasure to introduce Molly Haskell. Thank you.
I live right across the street, yet this is the first time I've been in here, and it's beautiful, and I've been looking forward to this for a long time. I was just pelted. I came and talked to Rabbi Savenor actually a few weeks ago, and then I was given the Reader's Guide, which I found very interesting, and then I was pelted with an email at 5 o'clock with more questions. So I don't know, I'm going to save some of those for the end. Maybe some of them are already incorporated in my talk, but I'm also going to deviate a bit from my usual talk because of a couple of the questions in the Reader's Guide that I thought would be interesting to address. So if I get lost, lose my place once in a while, you'll bear with me. I'm going to read briefly. This is the beginning. I'm actually going to use paper because I can't see the book. In the winter of 1993, Steven Spielberg is in Krakow filming Schindler's List. By day, he shoots a scene in a work camp. Children are being herded onto trucks for deportation, singing as if on a jolly field trip. A few run away, crouch in cellars and boxes, and when there are no more hiding places, jump into a latrine. By night, he is talking with the crew he's got a house in Krakow, rented house. He is talking with the crew at Industrial Light and Magic in Northern California via satellite, discussing the final editing of Jurassic Park, fiddling with the elbow of a velociraptor. The juxtaposition, as if dread and anxiety could thus be halved, one film allaying the stress of the other, seems almost inhuman, as well as superhuman. Last December, Spielberg is now 71. In his 8th decade on Earth, he is still making movies as fast as we can see them. What keeps him going? The answer, or rather the mystery, begins with the outsized fears of a little boy who began biting his nails while still in knee pants. A little boy who was spooked by everything. By the static on the radio, by Disney films, by the tree outside his New Jersey window that turned sinister in a storm, its branches weaving and waving like some otherworldly monster. What makes him unusual is not just the size of his fears, but his manner of hanging on to them. Rather than bury those shaming moments of childhood vulnerability, as most of us do, he nourished their memory, translated them into bold cinematic images, and projected them onto a terrified audience, as he had once relieved his own anxiety by terrorizing his sisters, locking them in closets and doing all sorts of terrible things. So powerful was the urge, and so successful an exorcism, that as a director, he would aim for nothing less than whole theaters full of spectators, biting their nails, or blissed out with shock and awe at close encounters with the paranormal. I'm going to just give a brief, just as a reminder of his career, excuse me one more time, a little water. Just a refresher, because he's made so many films, you sometimes, a title will come out and you think, oh, did he make that? He actually got started in the early 70s. It was a period, sort of when I came of age as a critic. The early 70s was when there was this group of filmmakers hanging out on the beach in California, which included Martin Scorsese, Brian De Palma, Francis Ford Coppola, and they were all going to take over movie making. They were the auteurs, but they were sort of dropping acid and hanging out and not really getting it together, except of course Coppola, who had made The Godfather. The rest of them were just trying to get going, but were still kind of feeling their oats in the late 60s and early 70s. Meanwhile, Spielberg was actually he had a day job. He was working in television at Universal, and he was always the one who was sort of in the system where the others, they were snorting and he was keeping his nose clean, no drinking. He made his first film, feature-length film, Duel was the first. It's wonderful. I don't know if any of you have ever seen that. It's a short film made originally for television of a truck pursuing a car. And I think it's a little sort of minor masterpiece. But Sugarland Express was the first commercial feature-length film. That was the one with Goldie Hawn as an ex-con on the run, trying to keep her baby. She's completely manic, and the whole film is a chase, trying to get her and get the baby away from her. And it was a commercial flop. Critics liked it, but it was a commercial flop, and he would never do that again. He didn't want to be an auteur. He didn't want to have a sort of elite audience. So what was his next film? Jaws. That was 75, and Jaws, of course, was so huge that he could do anything after that. So Jaws, then Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and this came out at the same time as Star Wars, and so the whole nature of filmmaking was changing with Spielberg and George Lucas. So then E.T., Raiders of the Lost Ark, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, Color Purple. Then he sort of changed direction a bit with Color Purple, Empire of the Sun, one of my own favorites, Always, Hook, Jurassic Park, and Schindler's List, both in 1993. And then Amistad, Saving Private Ryan, the war film for which he won an Academy Award, AI, Artificial Intelligence with the part Kubrick screenplay, Catch Me If You Can, the one about Frank Abagnale, the forger and pilot impersonator with Leonardo DiCaprio, Munich, Lincoln, Bridge of Spies, and now The Post, and also Ready Player One, which is going to come out in a few months. So two basically in 1 year, The Post and this Ready Player One, which young people know all about. It's something about a virtual reality game. Jaws and E.T. would become some of the top-grossing films of all time. And during this whole thing, he started the Survivors of the Holocaust Visual History Foundation, which I'm sure you know about. This was when he was making Schindler's List. Somebody came up to him, a woman came up to him and said, "I want you to film me." And he thought she wanted to be in the film or something like that, because they were using a lot of real people in Poland as extras. She said, "No, no, no. You know, we're all dying out. We're survivors who are all dying out. You need to take down our testimony." And it was an epiphany for him, and he started the Shoah Foundation, and then that became the USC Shoah Foundation, and of course it's become this incredible sort of tool, that's scholarship tool, and it's known internationally, and many other. He's been active in many other mercenary activities. All right, this is where I'm going to skip. So, I was going to say, in the weeks leading up, this is a sort of a fascinating little tidbit. In the weeks leading up to the 2014 Academy Awards, one of the factoids that they were trotting out to whip up interest in the Oscars was that they had there was a poll about who viewers, a statistic about who Oscar winners thanked most. The top two names, according to NBC's Lester Holt, were Steven Spielberg and God, with the latter receiving 19 to the former's 47. So, I mean, what did this mean? That he had touched more lives, boosted more careers than the Almighty, let alone L.B. Mayer, David Selznick, Irving Thalberg, Lou Wasserman, assorted agents, parents, and spouses. Or perhaps that the popular populace had simply become a lodestar to would-be filmmakers, like the celestial light in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, or the extraterrestrial pal in E.T. And he is. It's just stunning. I didn't realize at the time how his admirers are legion and fanatical. I mean, you really you risk your life if you say anything negative at all about him to these people, because he is there's so many things now that are based on Spielberg or inspired by them. There's a series called Stranger Things, I think that's what it's called. It's sort of inspired by Goonies. I mean, he's just had such a huge influence. At this point, I usually start in my talk, I talk really about why I was the wrong person. Why did Yale University Press choose me to write this book? Why I was the wrong person to write it, because I'm not a fan of Spielberg. And then why I was the right person. So I will maybe get to that in a minute. But what I thought, one of the, in the Reader's Guide, I was fascinated by a couple of questions. One of them is, none of his films portray American Jews and the American Jewish experience, the only possible exception being an animated feature that he produced but didn't direct, American Tale and Fievel Goes West. Have any of you seen those? Because they're really wonderful. And he had a lot to do with it. For instance, because his grandfather, Fievel, was hugely influential in his life, both good and bad. I mean, there were times when he was just terrified of him, but he had told him all these stories. And at one point, the producer wanted to give the mouse, it's these immigrant mice who come to America, give him a more American name, and Spielberg said, no, you can't do that. It's just incredibly disturbing, and also on the adult level, and yet it can be a sort of exciting adventure for children. This is continuing this reader's guide question. Given that fellow Jewish directors such as Woody Allen, Barry Levinson, the Coen brothers, and Noah Baumbach regularly feature Jewish characters and themes, what does this say about Spielberg? Is it fair to criticize him for this, and is it reasonable to expect something along these lines in the future? This fascinated me because it was something would never thought of in quite that way. And of course, there are other Jewish directors, Mike Nichols, Paul Mazursky, Stanley Kubrick, who also don't feature Jewish characters in their films. Mike Nichols is, in a way, The Graduate, but most of his films don't. I don't think it is quite fair. I think it's all about childhood. How did you grow up? What was your childhood like? Spielberg was born in Cincinnati, and they lived for the first 2 years of his life in a Jewish enclave in Cincinnati. That was when he had this sort of memory of seeing the Ark of the Torah, and this incredible moment where he was being in a stroller, being brought down the aisle, and the elders were singing, and there was this flaming image in front of him. I don't think he can possibly he was only 2 years old. Something of it stuck in his mind, both fearful and awesome, I think. And I think it was something that he managed to transform into all sorts of different images in his films, spiritual images, even religious images. Then his mother, he had this, I don't know if any of you saw the documentary on him that was recently on HBO, but he had these incredible parents. The mother, Leah, was she was a concert pianist who continued to play. She didn't play professionally, but continued to play after the children, Stephen and his 3 younger sisters, were born, continued to play. But the main thing about her was she was, and he called her the Peter Pan of the family. I mean, there was no discipline whatsoever. The father was a brilliant scientist and became one of the first computer engineers. So he got a job. Leah convinced him to go to graduate school. He got his engineering degree, got a job in GE in New Jersey. And Leah, at this point, she was part of that generation that wanted to assimilate. They had been in this Jewish enclave. The parents one parent was born in America, the others had all come from Poland or Ukraine. And this was the earliest environment. Then he was suddenly transplanted into a Protestant suburb in New Jersey. And this was the beginning of all the fears. I think he was a kind of anxious, nerdy boy anyway, but then these fears, and he wanted so much, he didn't, his mother at this point, I mean, the grandfather would come and he made a joke, they would hide the lobsters under the bed, but Leah very much wanted to be part of this American generation of suburbanites. But meanwhile, Stephen was surrounded by Catholics and Protestants who were celebrating Christmas and had all these decorations, and he couldn't do this, and he took the family, he wanted to see Santa Claus and their images of, all through the films, interestingly, there are images of Santa Claus. In 1941, the comedy about the Japanese attack that was the one sort of failure in his whole career, there's a big image of Santa Claus. So he even created a kind of nativity scene, according to one story. I mean, his father, I'll say right now, this is usually I mention later, but I didn't talk, he doesn't give, I approached his henchman, his aide, to see if he would talk to me. I actually didn't really want to talk to him, but I thought I should. I said if he would talk to me. And the person wrote back that he doesn't speak to biographers. It's a policy he had. And it's true that Joseph McBride, who wrote a full-dress biography of Spielberg wouldn't speak to him either, but McBride got to everybody else. He got to, except Leah. Spielberg forbid his mother, I actually was scared of what she would say, but he wouldn't let her talk. But she's talked everywhere else. So there's lots and lots of interesting blab from her and everybody else. And he talked to the teachers and classmates and everyone, and the father. So there was one story that he had created this light scene on his porch and had the lights up, and he was going to be Jesus Christ or something, because all the kids were saying, why did you kill Jesus Christ? So he was surrounded by that. Then his Orthodox grandfather would come and would call him by his Yiddish name. He had spoke Yiddish the first 2 years, or heard it the first 2 years of his life. And he would just want to crawl into a hole. So this was his relationship to Jewishness, and meanwhile the parents were fighting. They would eventually divorce, but it would take years and years and years. So somehow the fighting of the parents and his ambivalence about his Jewishness were all part of the undercurrent of his anxieties, I think, during this time. So then they moved from New Jersey he got a better job in Arizona, to an even more conservative neighborhood where he felt even more isolated. He was a teenager by now. He had big ears. He just was in agony. He was bullied. Then he says in the documentary, he said what turned him into a filmmaker was seeing Lawrence of Arabia, but actually what did it was he got a camera. His father found a camera for him. First he started taking, most people take home sort of these stodgy home movies, not Spielberg, not little Steven. He would get the family would be going on vacation, he would film it from this angle, and then he would make them get out and do it again from another angle. His mother said he did it from the hubcap. He was always looking for a kind of interesting angle, and he would do train wrecks. And then the Boy Scouts, the father, the interesting thing is during this period in Arizona, as you'll see in those early films like E.T., it's always the father especially Close Encounters, the father abandoning the family. In Close Encounters, he actually leaves to go to another planet. In E.T., he's off with his adulterous whoever. And this was Stephen's feeling about what was happening to the breakup of the family, which was just absolutely traumatic for him, much more, I think, than, some children just feel it more than others, whether the age or whatever. And the father was always the villain, the bad guy. In fact, as came out a few years after that, it was actually Leah, the mother, who was madly in love with Bernie, the father's best friend, who'd also come out to Arizona, and she was having a fling with Bernie, but he somehow couldn't see. I think it would have been just too shattering to see this mother that he worshipped and who was his pal. I mean, the father was off working long, long hours, as fathers did, and the mother not only would support him, she would write notes to the school to get him off school so he could go scouting for locations for his movies. So at the age of about 10, his father said, why don't you, he wanted to join the Boy Scouts, but he couldn't do, he wasn't an athlete, he wasn't good at all those activities. His father said, why don't you do a film and get the photography badge? So he made this short film, and they were mesmerized. And it was, I think, at that moment, not only was it that they loved this, he could tell stories like nobody else, even if he was just telling a story, they were all captivated. But it was having this audience and belonging, and that was when first time he ever felt he belonged anywhere, and I think that was sort of the moment where he became a filmmaker. So then he ended up making a film that year that actually had a premiere in Arizona before he went off to college, and they charged admission, and they had spotlights. His mother called him Cecil B. de Spielberg, and it was a big success, and so he was sort of on his way, and people that worked with him said they'd never seen anybody so focused in their lives. He was the oldest 14-year-old they'd ever met. But in another way, he was very young because he wasn't evolving. He was a nerd, and everything was film. He didn't want to go on dates. He didn't want to have a social life, or he didn't know how to have one. Everything was film. So what I would say to this question is this was his background, suburbia. And in fact, he says in the documentary, suburbia was my religion. Everybody was happy, all these happy families, the belief in the unity of the conformism was to him a kind of, he idealized it, and then of course it gets less idealized in movies like Poltergeist. You get both sides. It's never, one of the interesting things about Spielberg and what separates him from so many of those other kind of more radical type 60s and 70s directors, it's never, it doesn't have this oppressive idea of suburbia and us versus them. There's something much more expansive. So what I would say about the Jewish thing is he's for the underdog. And in fact, another question in the same Reader's Guide, I think, sort of addresses this. He says, the first three films, and I'd never actually thought of these quite this way, the first three films, Amblin, Duel, and The Sugarland Express, were road films, following their protagonists on a suspenseful chase. And then he asks, what is the significance of such movement through space in the life of Spielberg, throughout his oeuvre, and in the Jewish experience writ large? Well, I think that answers the question, because it is implicit in this. He is on the run. He says this in the documentary, and it's in the films. He's running from the bullies. I mean, the truck that pursues and stalks the car mile after mile after mile is a bully. And the little car is Spielberg in the midst of all these jocks and all these tormentors. He sees himself as the underdog. And then what's interesting to me is you think about this whole thing of movement that's so important in his films, and even not just a protagonist running, it's sometimes almost too much so, but I think the quintessence of Spielberg as his directorial style is movement. There's always movement. I mean, sometimes too much. I think in The Post, I don't know if you've seen it yet, I think it's a really well done and entertaining film, but sometimes it's a kind of pumped up, he can't just sort of sit and let people talk. It has to be galvanic. That's him. But so the thing is, in those early films, he's running away from something, and in the later films, like Minority Report and Catch Me If You Can, and even in a way, Bridge of Spies, he wants to get home. He's running. Well, in the earlier first two, he's running. He wants to get home. And Catch Me If You Can, you have Leonardo DiCaprio, who's been expelled. That's, I think, his most personal film, and I think it's a greater film than people have recognized, because they see it as something light and frothy, but it has lightness, it has swiftness, but there's something incredibly, I think, poignant. But so Leonardo DiCaprio has been expelled when the parents divorce, and he's trying to get home, and at the very end he comes back to the house where his mother now lives and looks through the window, and there is his mother with a new child, and and this is Spielberg. I think this is, there's a real deeper emotional level to that. So interestingly, in the later films, he's running, but in a different way, trying to get home to this home that no longer exists. I think I won't get into this too much now, but I think a more legitimate objection could be that and another thing is, I think he does, of course, deal with Jews directly in Schindler's List and Munich, and maybe talk about that a little bit later. But I think there is the outsider feeling, the sense of somebody on the defensive, on the run throughout his films, and he's reaching a large audience. And so, for one thing, I was thinking Mike Nichols, his films don't deal with Jews, except for the interesting thing is the casting of The Graduate. And likewise, Spielberg's casting in Jaws of Richard Dreyfuss, because both of those roles, normally in the old days of Hollywood, they would have been played by some waspy kind of protagonist. But Dustin Hoffman, something in Nichols made him choose Dustin Hoffman for that role, and it's crucial. And then Spielberg had looked at different, more sort of conventional people to play the scientist that Richard Dreyfuss plays in Jaws, and then he just settled on Dreyfuss. And Dreyfuss is so much, I don't want to say a mouthpiece, but a surrogate in both of the films he does with Spielberg, for Spielberg. He's a fast talker, and Spielberg is a fast talker, and he's manic, and he has this smart, focused view. And I think that was really interesting to put somebody like that in a mainstream film. So Hollywood, movies are getting a little more ethnic during this period anyway, but still, that I think, and in Close Encounters. So always you have this figure of an outsider, but he's reaching such a broad audience. I mean, the films of Woody Allen and the Coen brothers, great as they are, they reach a much smaller audience. And Spielberg always, you could say this is both his strength and weakness. He wants that big audience. He doesn't want a small coterie audience. So he is in some way bringing Jewishness or outsiderness, Jewishness into a larger, and of course, Schindler's List. So I will say one thing about, why did they, I was an unlikely choice to do this, not because I'm not Jewish. I mean, other people can have a problem with that, I guess, but my own feeling is that there shouldn't be boundaries of gender or faith or anything in writing. But more to the point is that I really wasn't a fan of his. I mean, we each had our blind spots, but his blind spots were my C spots, and my blind spots were his C spots. I responded to he's always said he never responded to European films. Well, those are just the ones that I did, and the European style films that these young American filmmakers were making in the 70s to adult, to the sort of murky and ambiguous erotic relations between men and women, and that was never what he was going to do. He was drawn to fantasy, to science fiction, to all the genres that I wasn't interested in. And also, we were very, I said this right up front, how hard we were on him when we were critics in the 70s, because, as I say, this was when the people like Mazursky and Robert Benton and Peter Bogdanovich, Robert Altman were doing these great movies, adult movies, independent movies, but somehow with Hollywood money. It was a period that was never going to last. It was a sort of little mini golden age. It was also this great period of cinephilia. Everybody was talking about movies and excited about movies. And suddenly all the talk was about money. I mean, you had Jaws, and then you had the blockbuster, and that changed everything. It changed movie making, it changed distribution, you had the multiplex, you had saturation advertising, and most critics were kind of horrified by this. And when we saw Jaws, we just thought it was, and Spielberg himself said it's a mechanism, it's a mechanical thriller to scare people. And that was what it seemed like at the time. And yes, it was incredibly well done. It was fluid, and it was scary, and it was brilliant in so many ways. But it was a technical achievement, it seemed. Now when you see what's followed in terms of the superheroes and the action films, I said it's like when we used to what we felt once when Barnes and Noble came and they drove out all the independent booksellers. Now we wish Barnes and Noble would come, So there's a kind of humanism in Jaws that doesn't have a real sense of character, not character development, but character in Jaws that's not in so many of the other action films that have followed. But that was what we felt. So we were hard on him, and I was worried. So then when he said he wouldn't, I wanted to make that clear, and I felt, well, it'll be a challenge to me. It'll challenge my prejudice. Maybe there's something wrong with me that I haven't been able to respond to these, especially to those early films that people love so much. And I think actually men, it seems to me, as I've talked about it and thought about it since writing the book, that men have loved those movies. Martin Amis wrote about how men cry at E.T. And so I think maybe there was something in me that just resisted it for all sorts of reasons. So I thought that it would be a great chance to sort of challenge my own prejudices in writing about it. So then he didn't want to see me, and then I came across this something on YouTube where he was speaking at an American Film Institute master class of young people who wanted to be directors. And this was right after Jaws and Close Encounters. So here he was in a baseball cap. He looked like he was about 16 years old, and yet he'd made all this money. And they were all suspicious and asking these questions. And he was saying he didn't want to be Wells. He didn't want to be a great auteur director. He just wanted to be a journeyman. So you have to take that with a grain of salt, I think. And he said, you just have to have confidence. You can't worry if critics like Andrew Sarris and Molly Haskell don't like your movies. So I thought, maybe this is why he doesn't want to see me. But I was actually relieved because I felt that it would have somehow been a compromise. If I'd met him, I would have liked him, and I would have had a hard time. And he said, everything about my life is in my films. And this is true. He started making films before he had a life. So everything about him is in the movie. So this, to me, was the invitation to do the kind of book I wanted to do, which was to tell his story through the films, and that's what I tried to do. And I think as time went on, I really came to admire him more and more. And generally, this is true. I think people were skeptical in the early days. He just was too successful. He made too much money. but in the long run, he's sort of worn well. And Bridge of Spies, the critics have all mostly like a lot of what he's doing. I think he's dedicated to film, and one of the questions I thought that Rabbi Savenor asked was something about the link was there a link between Jurassic Park and Schindler's List? Because he was doing those at the same time. And it suddenly struck me that Jurassic Park was when they first developed digital technology that we know today. Those dinosaurs, when he did Jaws, they wanted to use a real shark. And they sent some people down to Australia to film these shark scenes, but somebody almost got eaten alive, so they couldn't do that. So then they built this metal shark, and it was so clumsy and klutzy that they just could hardly use it. So because of that, they devised this way, aided by the incredible John Williams score, of just not showing it, except every once in a while you'd see a little fin somewhere. So it was much more terrifying because you never saw it. You just heard this thrumming John Williams score, and you thought it was going to come up any minute. So it was very Hitchcock that he knew that it's much more, what you don't see is so much more powerful than what you do. But by the time of Jurassic Park, digital technology had just come of age. And he was leery of it because it sort of represented to him his father and science, and he hadn't been good. That was one of the big tension was that the father was a brain and Stephen wasn't, or at least he wasn't in the conventional way. He wasn't good in school. His father couldn't see where he was going to go with his filmmaking. And he just felt inadequate in his father's eyes. I think that was really the major source of tension. And now all of a sudden he was getting into this world that was really his father's world. He actually took a course in computer sciences. But there's something strange about this CGI. There is something dehumanizing, I think, about digital technology and what it can do. And we're seeing this in so many ways in our technology, the simulation of people, replacing people. And then on the other side, Schindler's List, which is this great humane and humanitarian movie. So, it makes it's even more bizarre that he would be doing those two things at the same time. So I guess I just would say that I did come to admire for instance, I think we think of him as sentimental, and there is a strong streak of sentiment, but he's also, Minority Report and Empire of the Sun, J.G. Ballard and the science, can't think of his name, anyway, the writer of Minority Report, are two of the darkest writers in the 20th century, and the films have there may be sentimental touches, but they're really deeply dark. The other thing about Spielberg, this is, I think, and it just has been proven again, is how uncannily he is in tune with whatever's going on in the country at any given time. Minority Report was in the works before 9/11. It's all about, and then George Bush came in, and they 9/11, and he appointed Ashcroft and the Patriot Act, and suddenly all this surveillance was put in action, and that's what Minority Report is about. It's all about government surveillance and machines that know what you want to buy. It's incredibly prophetic. It's the author too. It escapes me. But it was so uncanny that Spielberg felt he had to apologize that when the film came out. He didn't want to seem unpatriotic. And now here he is again with the Post about the Pentagon Papers and the Washington Post and freedom of the press. It's a celebration of the First Amendment. I will say one of the questions was about his treatment of women. Has it evolved? Now I think here again, you don't get it all in any artist. And I think the defects and the virtues are sides of the same coin. So I think Spielberg's greatness is his feeling for childhood, for feeling for family, and his ability to return over and over again. It's also what keeps me away from him sometimes, is to return again and again to innocence. But you don't have that and also have an interest in adults and sex. The only sex in any of his movies basically is in The Color Purple, and it's lesbian, and it doesn't go that far. But I think it goes exactly far. It's a beautifully done scene, actually, and he hadn't gotten enough credit for that. But that's the only time. The Post you have a great, strong female character, Katharine Graham, but this is a script that came from somebody named Liz, basically an over-the-transom script. She'd never done anything before. Somehow it landed on Spielberg's desk, and it is great. It's really about a woman coming into her own. You've probably seen it or will see it or you know the story. So it's a terrific woman's part. I don't expect it. So I did take a somewhat feminist perspective, but not, I hope not belabored, because I don't think he can do it all. It's just that the women are all, I think, kind of sister figures. They're tomboys like Karen Allen in the Indiana Jones, or Kate Capshaw. That was interesting. The woman he ended up marrying is one of the oddest things of all in the Indiana Jones, where she appears. She's wonderful in this early scene where she's a nightclub singer in China, and it's a kind of Busby Berkeley number, and she's fabulous. And then all of a sudden she turns into this, what I call the screaming woman. It's a sort of archetype that runs through Spielberg, and she's just shrill. I mean, she's scared and shrill all the way through, and it's just very strange. And critics came down on her. The trouble is, when that happens in a film, everybody gets mad at the woman without, it's actually Spielberg who made her that way. He's not really that interested in women. He'll never have a sex scandal either, so that's a plus side of that. But that's not his thing, and I don't condemn him for it, because I think his strengths are what they are. And I think the thing that's so interesting about him is that he was born a filmmaker. He became a filmmaker intuitively, and he had to learn to be a human being. And one of the reviews called him, one of the London reviews of my book called him, I wish I'd thought of it myself, the boyish patriarch of Hollywood. And I think that somehow sums it. That paradox is what he is, because there is something patriarchal about him. He's mentored people. He's a great father. He's got a sense of mission. I think the end of Schindler's List, when you have the actual survivors appear, he broke with the frame, the artistic frame of the film, to show these real people. And I think during Schindler's List, he came, I think, two things: the birth of his son Max to Amy Irving, his first wife, and Schindler's List were what brought him back to Judaism. And then Kate Capshaw, whom he then married, converted, and I think not just to get him at all. I think she did have a feeling for it. She had a strong family feeling, and she not only converted and sort of helped him come back to Judaism, but also to reconcile with his father. So somehow he has, without diminishing his artistic, because he says in that documentary, and I say here too, that he needs to feel panicky. He needs to be insecure. If he knows what he's doing, then he's not going to do it very well. He needs to be in a state of absolute abject terror, and then the ideas start coming. So sometimes when you find the right person, love can be a sort of a down. It can be a softening influence that softens the edges, and I don't think that's quite happened. I think he's probably a happier person and still going strong. So with that, I think I'll stop and let the questions come. So thanks.
First of all, this is so wonderful to have you here. One of the, I love movies, and I've been reading it for years. So this is a highlight for me. It's very exciting.
Thank you.
And one of the nicest things, too, is that I don't think this will be the only time we see you, because I learned that you live in the neighborhood. So I'll be looking for you at Morton Williams.
That's right.
In the neighborhood.
We bonded over Morton Williams.
we did. They have wonderful fruit salad. Yeah.
Wonderful buffet.
So one of the things that you mentioned, is that you've never spoken to Spielberg before. So if you had a chance to meet him for coffee, what's the one question that you'd want to ask him?
I love that. That was your first question. I love that.
Yeah.
I thought about that. Well, the first question I'd say was, did you like the book? And then he might pretend he hadn't read it, but I wouldn't believe that. I think I would ask him about his father, because I'm just fascinated by that relationship. And then I would ask him maybe movie questions, because one of the things he says in that documentary is that he he saw Lawrence of Arabia and it blew his mind, and I don't think that's actually what made him become a filmmaker. It was one of the things. And then he just starts describing the scene where Peter O'Toole is in the desert and he's got this robe and he's flowing like that, and you see this shadow. And he says the shadow was painted in the sand. And I thought, wow. I would ask him, when did you know that? How did you know that? I mean, it's geekdom. This is what young movie makers are like now. They just know everything like that, how every shot is done. And that's why I was taking my life in my hands when I was writing this critical study, because they don't want, it's like when I was writing about Gone with the Wind, the people that love Gone with the Wind don't want a revisionist view of that. They're just happy with what there is. Anyway, I'm sort of fascinated by that mindset that is so obsessed and sees everything, but I also think it would just be fun to talk about movies with him.
So let me ask you a question. You asked, by the way, thank you for liking the questions. I spent a lot of time thinking about it. It's not scripted, but we had questions. We wanted to really put the thought into it. So the question that I had about Schindler's List and Jurassic Park, you went in a very different direction than the way I thought.
So what would you think?
Here's Schindler's List is about organized evil. In Jurassic Park, the film was really in some ways about the chaos theory, which is one of the things that you write about, is that it's very strongly mentioned in the book, but in the movie he doesn't play with it all that much. I'm just curious your thought, in being how do you think, is there a connection between the two films and the way that Spielberg deals with evil?
I don't know. I think there is, in all of his films, there is a sense of evil. I don't see it in Jurassic Park as clearly, maybe as you do. I think what's wild about Jurassic Park is how violent it is. I mean, you think of it as for children, and yet the children are being trampled by dinosaurs, so that it's absolutely terrifying. I mean, I think he's more interested in terror. I don't know. The evil. I'm thinking Minority Report. I don't think there's anything that's pure evil as much as Schindler's List. I mean, even Munich is much more, to some people's mind, too balanced, maybe you could say, by seeing some of the Palestinians' point of view, whereas in Schindler's List it's pure evil. But I don't think he's that interested in pure evil as such. I think he always wants that. That's what's interesting. That's the antithesis of the sentimentality, is he wants to see modifications, and that's why he's interested in somebody like Schindler, or even the Attenborough character. Like the Attenborough character was all bad in the Michael, what's his name, story. In Michael Crichton's story. Michael Crichton's story. Stevens saw him as a sort of impresario who's trying to get this thing. I think he identifies, he says, and I think he identifies with Schindler, although he said he identified with the Ben Kingsley character. He's more into the Ben Kingsley, but there's something of Schindler, the showman. He's a showman. Attenborough's a showman. Schindler's a showman. And he's a showman, and that's why he's always going to do films. He's not going to make a little art house movie about the Holocaust. He's going to make, and this is what's, I think, extraordinary about the film, to make a film about that subject, that dark, that so many people would see. I mean, it's just astonishing. I just think I don't think anybody else could do it. And he's also paved the way, whatever one thinks of it, and I think there's a whole spectrum of points of view. He's paved the way and for other films that will be darker and will be confronting it for more films to come, I think.
So if we can spend a moment on evil, we talk about good things here though too.
Yeah.
So, I'd like to talk about Jaws for just one moment. You write in the book, and there was a lot of conversation about this amongst the community, that the shark could be understood to represent the threat to men posed by the women's movement.
Well,
and
I think I've expressed. I didn't express it quite that clunkily. I hope. By women, I mean, well, other people have said.
It was a quote, but maybe I miswrote it.
Well, okay. Yeah. But no, I talked about it as everyone, the vagina dentata, which is Freud's, I think, term. Other people have used it, or the dangerous teeth, which is the vagina. So, I mean, I'm not the person who thought of that. And you can see, I think you can see the shark is that kind of menace. Is all sorts of different kinds of menace. It can be the social, some form of social menace, which is out of control or unpredictable. But I think it was interesting that you had this coming along at a time, and you have these three men who represent different forms of masculine, either bluff, bravado, and insecurity. And I mean, I don't believe in spelling it out. I probably did say that, but I think I said it along with other things so that it's not, this is just one sort of angle of vision on it. And I don't see any reason not to see it that way.
You know, my favorite line from the movie is when I think it's, what's his name, Quint, says, I think we're going to need a bigger boat, which I think was the great. I'll tell you a true story, and it's okay because it's amongst our closest friends and on live stream, so it's okay. So my mom, when I was a kid, we went to see the Apple Dumpling Gang. And did anybody see that movie? It was the Apple Dumpling Gang.
Where was it?
It was rated G it was by Disney. It was really wonderful. So at the time I was, I think, 6 years old, and my mom locked her keys in the car. So the movie theater was so nice, and they said, listen, when your husband, you know, in a couple hours, it's going to take him to get here from work to come and you know, to bring the other set of keys, you can watch any movie you want. You and, you know, the boys can watch any movie you want. I was the youngest of three. I think at the time I was 6, and my brothers said, we have to see Jaws. So I can tell you, up until that very day, I loved taking a bath. I have not taken a bath since. It's a true story.
Well, you better not say psycho, then you'll never be clean because you won't be able to take a shower either.
Yeah. You know, strangely enough, it's not the shower, it's chocolate syrup that freaks me out. But anyway, so
let me just say one thing about that. I don't want to just leave the feminist angle.
Yeah, please.
So one point I make is that the films that I've just described by these older directors, Mazursky and Altman and all these, feature great women in them. And then all of a sudden, just after that, the women's movement is coming along, and all of these, Scorsese, all of these young filmmakers, Schrader, are really very much in flight from women in their movies. They're really about men, they're about themselves, they're personal, they're guy films. They didn't need women, you know, they weren't working at the studio system you sort of were obliged to have women in films because the women market, it was part of the marketing and everything else. Suddenly there was no obligation to have, and they were in flight. And then you got these bonding movies about these schlubby guys that, you know, didn't have, you know, it was this whole different forms of male escape. So it wasn't just Spielberg, it was a thing that was really sort of happening then.
That was the phenomenon.
I think so. I mean, I wouldn't belabor it, but I think it's there, you know, it's there. It's sort of implicit in a lot of things.
So, you know,
the Godfather, he closes the door. I mean, of course, this is the way that mafia does, but still, closing the door on the woman, she's not allowed she's not part of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Spielberg once said, every time I go to a movie, it's magic, no matter what the movie's about. And one of the things that I really enjoyed when we met just a few weeks ago, we talked about the awe that's in the film, and you write about it so beautifully in the book. All of his films, E.T. at the end, that
thing with the light, that blinding light.
The Close Encounters, you know, that end with all that light. Yeah. Also, the Raiders of the Lost Ark, which there's a beautiful irony there, which is it's spiritual light. But he and Marion, he says, don't look at the light.
You can't look
so there's something about looking at that light, but there's this sense of awe and you know.
And terror, because the little boy opening the door, and it's blinding. It's both. I mean, I think it's always a combination of awe and terror. I mean, Joseph McBride describes the scene beautifully, the scene of the little boy looking at the art. I mean, I think it's all retrospective because he couldn't have seen all that at the time, but he describes it in purely, I would say, benevolent terms, whereas I think it's both. I think it's the unknown, but it's also frightening because we don't know what it is, and I think he does capture that. In a way, he's not afraid. There's something fearless about Spielberg, because he will deal with religion in his films in a way that no other director, I mean, others do, but not, I mean, Scorsese has used religious motifs in his films, but in Spielberg, they're more expansive somehow. I mean, I think when the question about not making Jewish characters, but I think this whole thing of growing up in suburbia, he grew up amazingly without any kind of axe to grind. He had the terror and the fear and all that, and yet somehow there's this kind of generosity and almost ecumenism in him. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you a question, though, because is there a Jewish quality to the awe? Is there a Jewish quality that you see, in some ways, even as an outsider looking in,
well, you
writing
asked
the
one
book?
question that I thought was really interesting, which was, something about...
And there was only one?
No, about the Judah. Did I learn anything? Something about learning. Do you remember what it was? Learning anything about Judaism?
Yeah, I mean, what did you learn about?
Yeah, well,
about Judaism by writing the book?
I don't know if I learned anything about Judaism, but I thought a lot about why this moment of having the son was so cataclysmic and important for him, and I think that is I can't speak for Catholics, but I think Protestants, of course they want their children to be brought up in the faith and they're baptized and all the rest, but it's not, this moment of a father having a son is something, it's family, of course, there's a huge feeling for family, but it's also a kind of defense. We have to stand together because we don't know what's going to happen. I mean, I think that there's something there. Do you see that? So I saw that I just thought a lot about Spielberg and why that son, it seems to me was you don't know what a turning point, but it seemed to me having that son, and he says he just looked at that son and he was Jewish and he wanted the son to be Jewish,
So maybe there's something that it's one thing to be, like what's it called, to be pursued because your own security's on the line, but when there's somebody else at home and child.
Yeah.
And maybe that's something, I don't really know enough about his relationship with Arnold. Maybe that's something he didn't feel or he was making up for, or he felt that he was able to give. Yeah. But there is something I wanted to go back to because of after reading the book, I went to see Duel.
Yeah.
And I thought Duel was really excellent. It was really powerful, very simple, but very powerful.
To me, terrifying, because I'm scared of driving. I mean, I have nightmares about the night before I'm going to have to not be able to merge onto a highway or something, So I just think it's just something. Well, and Jaws too. I mean, that's why I don't want to make it just about women's movement. It's primal. He gets to something primal in all of these. I mean, it's about our fear of driving, but it's about deeper fear, a nameless fear.
But let me ask you a question. How much is that about Spielberg, the awkward kid, or Spielberg, the Jew, who feels that society or American society or knowing what happened over in Europe, it's a larger thoughtfulness on
Well, I don't think
his part.
you can parse it. I just think it's all there. I mean, he knew, he was told stories from the time he was young. He knew about persecution. It's all there in those two animated features. Explicitly. Those are absolutely explicit about persecution, but I don't think you can separate the awkwardness of the kid and his Jewishness, and a lot of the awkwardness is about that, and a lot of it is because he's a nerd. So, I mean, the power, it's the two things fuse, and it's a compound in a way. It makes it all the more.
Right.
And everybody can identify with that on some level. Yeah.
So we got a question over Twitter. This is great. So you said that his marriage to Kate brought him back to his father. Please explain what you mean and how that actually occurred.
Well, I think once he had a child, as so often happens, you have a child, you start seeing your own parent differently, and you start sympathizing. And I don't think he even knew. Still, I don't think he knew yet that it had really been his mother who was the adulterer. But I think he was moving in that direction. He had made Hook. There was something. She just said, "I want you to get together with your father." And it was about the time of Hook, and they did, and it worked. And meanwhile, he was thinking about saving. He always loved. His father had done amazing things when he was growing up. He had gotten him an airplane. He had been in the military he was an Army engineer or something. He'd been in the Pacific, and he told Stephen stories about that. Stephen loved that. He managed to get a plane for him for one of these little action films that he was going to make, and he was helping him with props and this and that. So you sort of, there's a disconnect when you see how much he didn't like his father, and he was alienated from his father, and yet his father did all these. That's what I want to ask him about. But I think there was actually a real moment where she said, "Let's get together," and from then on, they talked about. He dedicated Saving Private Ryan to his father, and I think from then on, and I think which one of the indie ones where you have Sean Connery and Harrison Ford, that wonderful
third one,
this wonderful reconciliation, funny reconciliation. So I think it goes from there.
Let me ask you, if Schindler's List had been focused on Isaac, on the Jewish character, in your opinion, do you think the movie would have had the impact or had the audience that it did?
No, I don't. I mean, I think then it would have been an art film. It would have been at the Lincoln Plaza. I mean, I don't know. Who knows? If Steven Spielberg can maybe do anything. I think he's an awfully important character. I mean, he's the conscience of the film. But what makes Schindler great is he's such a mystery. I mean, he was a swaggering, shady sort of character, and just out for his commercial interest, and then suddenly somehow, I mean, there's something exciting and inexplicable about that. There's a mystery at the heart of it, which is, I think, gives it this narrative excitement and drive. I mean, not that there's not plenty going on, but I think it's, I don't know, to me, there's a chemistry, a dynamic in the film that has to have all three of those characters in it, and the Ralph Fiennes too. I mean, they're all crucial. And also Oskar Schindler's there to show how many, you said about implication, how many people didn't do anything.
Right.
And I also think people, I mean, I know there's an argument, and I'm not the one, I mean, far be it from me, because I think everyone comes at it with personal, and everyone here probably has had relatives, and and not everybody, but some people felt that, as so often happens, there were no Jewish individuals in it. But I think one of the things that happens in all of this is, Primo Levi and everybody else writes about, is the dehumanizing, the de-individualizing that occurs, and that's the whole thing about names, and why he thinks it's so important. We've got to have the names. But Spielberg has this way, and he does this in Empire of the Sun as well, where you have this crowd scene, and yet the camera picks up faces. I mean, you don't get a whole character study, but you get something vivid and memorable. And he does it in Amistad. There are all these in fact, every film you see, there are these faces that come at you that you don't forget.
Right. Is there, we received a question from the An Shemet Synagogue in Chicago, where I began my career 22 years ago. So I just want to get a shout out to Chicago. Thank you all very much, and I'm doing fine. From the cantor there, Cantor Burke.
Take him back.
And her question is, do you see other directors that have similar arcs in their need to address their personal formative experiences through their films, through their work?
Well, I think I wouldn't express it that way. I don't think they feel, it's just what you do. I think all artists and writers, anyone that writes anything that's character-driven is feeding off of childhood unconsciously. Spielberg is, I think, closer to, I think he's the only one, probably one of the few people who just so consciously recreates childhood. Most people, it somehow suffuses the characters in some unconscious way. I mean, Woody Allen wrote about radio days, about childhood, but it's not quite the same. I think the need is there. It's not a conscious need. It's just it's something that's it's really the propelling. Probably the childhood is the propelling force for everything. But whether it comes out explicitly is probably Spielberg is unique, almost unique in that, I think.
Your book concludes with the Bridge of Spies, and it's since then we have The Post, and we also have Ready Player One, which I read recently is compared to like Willy Wonka. It's a modern Willy Wonka. Right. And hopefully he has many more movies in him to come. But one day we're gonna look back, and when the oeuvre is sort of closed, and what do you think his legacy will be?
Well, it's just sort of hard to assess. It's so massive and so diverse. I mean, he made these. People thought all he can do is make films about childhood. So then he made The Color Purple, and then you thought all he could do is this, and then he makes adventure films, and then science fiction, and then he comes to very human movies like Munich and Bridge of Spies. So I think it's almost hard to. I think now, I mean, what I said in the book, it seems to be the line everyone's taking in the reviews of The Post is that. Yes, he's tremendously entertaining. Yes, he keeps things going, but he does tend to underline. He does. He overscore. I think the John Williams scores are often just too prominent and too insistent. He doesn't leave anything to the audience's imagination. That's the downside, and I think he's never going to change. On the other hand, he does incredible. He makes high-class entertainment. And I'm not saying it's not art. I don't know. Leave that for future generations to decide. I mean, the funny thing about the documentary, I think he had control of every image in the film because it's pure kind of hagiography, which is what most documentaries are. But I'm sure he had complete control. But what was I going to say? About it, I don't know what I was going to say.
The legacy and the HBO biography that was just on.
I'll think of it. But anyway. I mean, he's setting out how. I know what it was. Yeah. So all they've got on there are people that think he's great. So they're constantly defending him against charges that nobody's ever making. I think it would have been kind of interesting to have a little voice of skepticism in there. I mean, I think Tom Stoppard is the one. He wrote the screenplay for Empire of the Sun. I actually think that's one of the least sentimental movies he ever made. Right. But he found something sentimental in that. So that's it. The downside of wanting to please everyone is slick, a tendency towards slickness and to overemphasis and over clarity. Right. He doesn't want dark shadows, and that's
if we're looking for any.
I mean, that's wrong to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, because there are dark shadows in Schindler's List. I mean, and there is darkness in these films, but I think I would say an insistence on clarity and I mean, you don't go out of the theater in that kind of way that you're intrigued by something you haven't quite, like something like The Phantom Thread, which I don't love, but there's something so intriguing about that film, and you're not quite sure where it's going, and then it goes, you think it's this, and then it's something else. You're never going to get anything puzzling and challenging like that in Spielberg, but you get a lot. You get a tremendous amount, and right. I think I came away feeling there's more to it to him than I had given him credit for.
Thank you. We want to thank you for a wonderful evening this evening. Enlightening.
Thanks.
Thank you for the book, and you've given us a lot to think about. I think you've also given us another way of seeing the film. We have a lot of wonderful things to look forward to here at Park Avenue. Next week, our What Matters series continue. Organ donation in the Jewish tradition, January 16th. The Lyman Meisel family, the Shabbaton, takes place the last weekend of this month, January 26th. And our community conversation will continue on Sunday, January 28th. Our next Reading Jewish Lives series will take place, I believe, on March 15th, and we will read about Yitzhak Rabin, and I encourage you to read the book and not just see the movie. I want to thank you all for being here. I would also like to thank you, Beth Levick, our manager of Synagogue Programming, and Nan for the introduction, and for everybody for your interest and for your passion in everything that we do. We're also selling books outside, and we hear that you're gracious enough to autograph a few. That will be fantastic, and if you're online, we'll be thinking of you. So have a great night, and everyone keep warm. Thank you again. Thank you so much.